Jim Carver's voice cut through the golden hum of the restaurant like a blade. $1 million, he said, his tone dripping with contempt, if you can heal these legs. The words hung in the air, slicing deeper than the $20 bill he tossed at Lila Bennett's feet. Gasps rippled from nearby tables at the Pinnacle, Manhattan's crown jewel of fine dining. His wheelchair gleamed under the chandelier light, his jaw set in stone, as if daring her to flinch. But Lila didn't bend, didn't stoop to pick up the bill. She stood, tray in hand, looking him dead in the eye. Your laughter, she said evenly, hides a deeper wound than those legs ever could. The room went still, forks frozen midair, champagne bubbles pausing in their rise. And for a moment it wasn't the glittering skyline or the smell of seared duck that defined the night, but the electric charge between a man who'd lost the will to hope and a woman who refused to be diminished. Before I go on, I want to know, where are you watching from? Let us know in the comments. And if this story moves you, subscribe to the channel and give it a like. It's your support that keeps these powerful stories alive. Lila could feel her pulse in her fingertips, but her face remained calm. She'd been here before, not in this exact restaurant, not in front of a former tech mogul whose name once graced the covers of Fortune and Wired, but in the company of men who thought cruelty was a birthright. She adjusted the tray in her hands, the scent of rosemary and garlic brushing past her nose, and took one small step backward. She knew his type, wounded, wealthy, convinced that money could buy a clean conscience. Vincent Crowley sat 3 tables away, his glass of Bordeaux catching the light as he watched the exchange with a predator's smile. He leaned back, the crisp navy of his tailored suit unwrinkled, his cufflinks catching the chandelier's glow. When Jim spoke, Vincent didn't look surprised, only amused, as if he'd been waiting for this moment. He gave Jim the smallest nod, a silent, go on, as though Jim were a pawn in a game only Vincent knew the rules to. Jim's lip curled in something between a smirk and a sneer. You heard me, he said, his voice low now, meant only for her but loud enough for those leaning in to catch. $1 million. Heal me, and it's yours. He tapped his lifeless legs with 2 fingers. Or keep serving duck and wine until you're too old to stand. Lila didn't take the bait. You think the worst thing about you is that you can't walk, she said quietly. It isn't. Her voice was warm, but it carried weight, the kind that made people sit up straighter. She turned and walked toward the kitchen, each step deliberate. Behind her, she heard Vincent's oily chuckle. Don't waste your time, sweetheart, he called, his tone sharp with condescension. Grace Thompson, the bartender, had been polishing a row of wine glasses when the exchange began. She set the towel down, her eyes narrowing as she followed Lila into the kitchen. You're bigger than his pain, Lila, Grace said, touching her shoulder. Don't let it touch you. But it had touched her, not in the way Vincent wanted, not in the way Jim intended. It had touched something old and deep, a place in her that remembered the ICU's sterile beeps and the way her daughter Emma's tiny hand had fit inside hers before the leukemia took her. She had walked away from nursing after that loss, telling herself she couldn't fix people anymore. Tonight, she felt that vow tremble. In the dining room, Jim sat back in his chair, the weight of her words settling into the cracks of his armor. He hated that she hadn't flinched. He hated that she'd seen him. And somewhere under that hate, buried beneath layers of grief, rage, and shame, was something he hadn't felt in years, the faint sting of truth. Vincent leaned toward him. Don't give her another thought, he murmured. Women like that? They're looking for an angle. You give them an inch, they'll take the whole bank account. Jim didn't reply. His eyes were fixed on the swinging kitchen door, as if expecting her to reappear. She did, but not to serve him. Lila emerged with a tray bound for another table, her eyes never flicking in his direction. Yet, somehow, he felt the weight of her presence with every pass she made through the room. Her restraint, her refusal to grovel, unsettled him more than any insult could have. By the time his dessert arrived, a flourless chocolate torte he barely touched, Jim's earlier satisfaction had soured. He left without another word to her, but he carried the echo of her voice all the way to his car. In the kitchen, Grace leaned against the counter. "That man's pain is a fortress," she said. "But you, my friend, you know how to find the cracks." Lila shook her head. "I'm not looking for cracks. I'm just not afraid to stand in front of the wall." What neither of them knew was that the night's brief collision was the start of something neither could have predicted. Jim Carver thought he had ended the conversation when he rolled away from that table. Vincent Crowley thought he had tightened his hold on a man whose fortune he intended to bleed dry. And Lila Bennett thought she was simply walking away from another cruel man's words. But the truth was already moving, quiet and unseen, like a river deep beneath the city. And before long, it would rise to the surface, changing all of their lives in ways none of them could imagine. The Hamptons estate loomed like a glass fortress against the autumn sky, its walls reflecting the pond that curled along the back lawn. Lila Bennett stood at the edge of the driveway, gripping the strap of her overnight bag. She had accepted the assignment only after a restless night, her mind replaying Jim Carver's mocking words from the pinnacle. She could have refused, should have, maybe, but something about the way he had gone quiet after her reply told her there was more under that bitterness. Now, she was here, ready to step into the private world of a man who'd once commanded boardrooms and now barely left his own property. The front door opened, and there he was. Jim sat in his wheelchair, wearing a charcoal sweater and a guarded expression. "Well," he said, his tone clipped, "my wager must have piqued your interest." Lila kept her voice even. "I'm here to work, not to gamble." She stepped inside, her eyes skimming the interior, sleek glass walls, polished stone floors, and a grand piano pushed into a corner of the music room, its surface cloaked in dust. Jim wheeled backward, gesturing for her to follow. "This is temporary," he said. "Don't get comfortable." His sarcasm was a wall he built brick by brick, but Lila wasn't there to tear it down in one swing. She simply nodded, placing her bag in the small bedroom down the hall from his. Over the next few days, her routine took shape, preparing meals that balanced nutrition with flavor, ensuring his blanket stayed neatly over his legs during the chill mornings, adjusting the lighting in his study when the afternoon glare threatened his eyes. She didn't hover, didn't pity. And that unsettled him more than if she had clucked over him like a nurse. One evening, as she ladled stew into a bowl, Vincent Crowley appeared at the front door, his polished grin in place. "Jimmy," he called, stepping into the foyer without waiting to be invited, "you've got company." His gaze flicked to Lila, lingering just a fraction too long. "Ah, the new help. Charming." Jim's jaw tightened. Vincent settled into a chair across from Jim, crossing one leg over the other with calculated ease. "I'd be careful with this one," he said, his voice dripping with feigned concern. "You don't know her story. People get close for reasons that aren't always pure." Jim didn't respond immediately, but Lila could feel his attention shift toward her, testing her reaction. She met his eyes. "I'm not here for your money," she said. "I'm here for what you've buried inside yourself." Her words hung in the air, quiet but firm. Vincent laughed softly. "Poetic. But I've been in enough courtrooms to know that poetry doesn't keep the lights on." Jim glanced away, and the conversation veered into business, numbers, investments, the kind of talk that shut Lila out but kept her listening from the kitchen doorway. Later, Grace called from Brooklyn. "So, how's the king in his castle?" she asked, her voice carrying a mix of humor and concern. Lila leaned against the counter, staring out at the moonlit pond. "Guarded," she said. "But there's a crack in the armor. I just have to decide if it's my place to step through it." Grace didn't hesitate. "You've already stepped through. Keep going." The next morning, Lila brought a small object into the music room, a smooth riverstone, its surface worn by years of handling. She placed it on the piano, the sunlight catching its faint green veins. Jim wheeled in, pausing when he saw it. "What's that?" he asked. "It belonged to my daughter, Emma," Lila said. "She collected stones from every place we went. This one, she held on the day the doctors told us there was nothing more they could do. She said it made her feel steady, even when everything else was falling apart. She let the silence rest between them. I kept it because it reminds me that even in the hardest places, there's something solid to hold on to." Jim's eyes stayed on the stone, his fingers twitching slightly on the armrest of his chair. "You keep that with you?" "Always," she said. "And now it's here, because I think you could use something solid, too." She didn't push it toward him, didn't insist he touch it. She just left it there, and over the next few days, she noticed it migrating closer to the edge of the piano, as though he'd been turning it over in his hands when she wasn't looking. Vincent returned twice more that week, each time finding a way to cast shadows on Lila's presence, jokes about caregivers who become heirs, offhand comments about trust and betrayal. But each time, Jim seemed less certain of Vincent's words. By the end of the week, something had shifted. One evening, as Lila prepared tea, she caught Jim watching her from the study doorway. "Why do you bother?" he asked suddenly. "Because," she said, setting the cup in front of him, "I've seen people come back from places they thought were permanent. Not because they found a cure, but because they found a reason." She didn't linger for his response, but as she walked away, she saw him glance at the river stone resting on the arm of his chair. What neither of them could admit, yet, was that the reason he asked might already be sitting in his living room, pouring him tea and refusing to see him as just a man in a chair. The music room had always been more ornament than sanctuary, a silent witness to the life Jim Carver once had. Its grand piano sat like a relic, the black lacquer dulled by dust, keys untouched for years. But that morning, the room felt different. Sunlight streamed in from the east-facing glass wall, pooling across the polished floor. Lila Bennett was there, kneeling beside Jim's wheelchair, guiding him through a series of slow stretches. "Breathe into it," she said softly. "Don't force the movement. Let your body remember." Jim closed his eyes, focusing on the pull in his hamstrings. It was tedious work, the kind he would have scoffed at months ago. But today, he didn't resist. He inhaled, exhaled. And then, so faint he thought he imagined it, he felt a tingling along his right thigh. His eyes opened, his breath caught. "Did you?" "I saw it," Lila said, her face calm but her eyes lit with quiet encouragement. "Your body's remembering because your soul is." He laughed once, dry and disbelieving, but the sound carried something else, hope, the kind that scared him more than the accident ever had. His gaze drifted to the piano. "I used to play every night," he said. "After the accident. I couldn't stand to even look at it." "What would happen if you touched it now?" Lila asked. His fingers hesitated over the armrest. Then, almost reluctantly, he rolled himself forward. His right hand hovered above the keys, shaking slightly before pressing a single note. The sound rang out, pure and trembling, filling the room. He didn't play another, but his shoulders dropped, as if the air had shifted. For the first time in years, Jim wasn't just existing, he was participating in the moment. That fragile piece shattered 2 days later. It began with a phone call Vincent Crowley took in the driveway, his voice sharp and low. Lila had been walking past the open study window when she overheard just enough, her name, the word press, and Vincent's signature laugh, the one that always sounded like he was closing a deal. She didn't mention it to Jim, but she felt the knot in her stomach tighten. By the following morning, it was everywhere, on gossip blogs, in the lower scroll of a morning talk show, caregiver cash grab? Former tech mogul's nurse under fire. The articles painted her as an opportunist with a tragic backstory, tailor-made to pry open Jim's wallet. Anonymous sources, Lila could guess who, claimed she was positioning herself to control his fortune. Grace was the first to call. "Lila, you need to see this. And you need to fight back." "I can't fight shadows," Lila said. Not until I know where they're coming from. They're coming from him, Grace snapped. Vincent. Who else benefits from cutting you out? When Jim saw the headlines, his jaw clenched. Did you, he began, then stopped, the words tasting like ash. Lila met his eyes. You think I'm here for your money? No, he said after a pause. I think you've been caught in someone's crosshairs. The next hour was chaos, calls from Jim's attorney, messages from old business contacts warning him to distance himself. Vincent arrived unannounced, his faux concern practically dripping onto the marble floor. These things take on a life of their own, he said, his voice smooth. Best to cut her loose before the damage sticks. Get out, Jim said quietly. Vincent blinked, then smiled like a man humoring a child. Jim. I said get out. Jim's voice didn't rise, but it carried weight. Vincent left, but not before brushing past Lila with a smirk that promised this wasn't over. By that evening, the backlash had reached its peak. Reporters camped outside the estate gates, drones buzzed over the pond. Lila stayed inside, her shoulders tense, her phone silenced. Then came the knock on her bedroom door. Jim sat in his chair, the Riverstone resting in his palm. You told me once it was something solid to hold on to, he said. Feels like I could use it now. She sat across from him. The noise will pass. It always does. But if you believe even a fraction of what they're saying. I don't, he interrupted. I've been lied to enough to know the difference between a story and the truth. He set the Riverstone on the arm of her chair. This is yours. But it's keeping me steady right now. In the days that followed, the media storm began to lose steam, not because it faded on its own, but because Grace refused to let Lila stand alone. She organized a petition in Harlem, calling on people whose lives Lila had touched to share their stories. Former patients from her nursing days, neighbors she'd helped care for after accidents, single mothers she'd mentored, one by one, they posted videos and letters online. We see you, Lila, Grace said in one clip. We know the truth. The groundswell of support turned the tide. Articles that had painted her as a schemer began running, human interest angles, calling her the nurse with a heart of steel. It wasn't vindication, Lila didn't need that, but it stripped Vincent's campaign of its bite. And through it all, Jim's exercises continued. The tingling in his leg grew into small, controlled movements. He began testing his weight with Lila's help, his hands gripping the piano for balance. The day he took 3 unassisted steps across the music room, his breath caught, not from the exertion, but from the realization that he could. Looks like I owe you $1 million, he said, his voice thick. You don't owe me anything, Lila replied. Except maybe to keep going. But progress brought its own risks. Vincent, realizing he was losing his hold, shifted tactics. He began calling members of Jim's old company board, hinting that Jim's newfound energy might lead him to make reckless financial moves that could hurt their interests. He painted the Emma Bennett Foundation, which Jim and Lila had been quietly planning, as a vanity project ripe for abuse. One night, Jim sat at the piano, the Riverstone beside the sheet music, and played a halting, incomplete melody. Lila recognized it immediately. Hush, little warrior, a lullaby she'd sung to Emma in the hospital. She closed her eyes, letting the sound wash over her. When the last note faded, Jim said, I want to fund this foundation. Not just for me. For you. For Emma. For every person who's been told they won't walk again, not because their body can't, but because no one gave them a reason to try. Lila swallowed the lump in her throat. Then we'll do it. Together. Outside, autumn leaves skittered across the glass terrace. Inside, the air was thick with something new, not just hope, but resolve. The smear campaign had failed. The legs that were supposed to stay still were moving again. And the man who had once mocked her in a crowded restaurant was now planning to build something that would outlast them both. But Vincent Crowley wasn't finished. And the next move he made would force them to fight for more than just a foundation. It would be a battle for the very purpose they had begun to build together. The Manhattan boardroom was a world away from the pond at the Hamptons estate. Cold light poured from recessed panels, bouncing off polished steel and glass. Around the long table, men and women in tailored suits shuffled papers, adjusting their expressions into masks of professional detachment. At the head sat Jim Carver, a cane resting against his chair. He didn't need it to walk the short distance from the door anymore, but he carried it as both a tool and a declaration. Beside him sat Lila Bennett, her notes neatly stacked, the Riverstone tucked into her pocket like a hidden shield. This meeting was supposed to be a celebration. The Emma Bennett Foundation had gone public just 3 weeks earlier with a $7 million endowment, enough to fund spinal injury rehabilitation, mental health counseling, and scholarship programs for veterans and underserved youth. The Harlem Clinic, their flagship site, had already begun seeing patients, 300 in total, including 80 veterans, with 50 scholarships awarded to aspiring physical therapists. Testimonials had been pouring in, people walking again, people reclaiming their lives. But Vincent Crowley wasn't here to celebrate. He sat halfway down the table, leaning back in his chair with calculated ease. In front of him lay a stack of papers bound with a red clip, an accountant's report, or at least something that looked like one. Before we move forward, Vincent said smoothly, I believe the board should review some concerning figures. He tapped the stack. According to these records, the foundation has sustained $3 million in losses in just the last quarter. Lila's head snapped up. That's impossible, she said, her voice firm but measured. Every transaction is documented and reconciled. Vincent smiled the way a man does when he's confident the trap is already sprung. Then I'm sure you won't mind if we verify these findings with an independent audit. His tone dripped with faux reasonableness, but the implication was clear, mismanagement, maybe even fraud. Jim leaned forward, his eyes cold. Where did you get those numbers? From a source within your accounting team, Vincent replied without hesitation. A concerned insider. It was a lie, Lila knew, but a dangerous one. Even a hint of financial impropriety could scare away donors and shut down the clinic. And Vincent was betting that the board, most of them old business associates of Jim's, people who still saw him through the lens of his accident, would rather cut their losses than risk their reputations. The room was tense, the kind of tension that feeds on silence. Lila reached into her folder and pulled out a series of reports, bank statements, grant receipts, payroll logs, each one with matching signatures and dates. These are the foundation's financials for the same period, she said, sliding copies across the table. Reviewed by 2 independent CPAs, both of whom have signed off without reservation. One board member, a woman in a burgundy blazer, skimmed the pages. These figures don't match yours, Vincent. Of course they don't, Vincent said easily. If there's fraud, you wouldn't expect it to be sitting in the official books. Jim's cane tapped once against the floor, a sharp crack that cut through the murmurs. You've been poisoning the well since day one, Vincent, he said. I let it slide because I thought you were a friend. But friends don't drag lies into rooms where the truth could save lives. Vincent's smirk faltered, just slightly. I'm protecting your interests. No, Jim said, standing. It was only a few steps, but the movement was deliberate, a living rebuttal to every whisper about his limitations. You're protecting your control. And that ends today. He turned to the board. Effective immediately, I'm resigning as chairman of the foundation. A ripple of shock moved through the room. I'm appointing Lila Bennett as my successor. She's the one who's been here every day, building this from the ground up. She's the one you can trust. Lila's breath caught. Jim. This isn't about me anymore, he said, his voice steady. It's about the mission. And I won't let it die because someone wants to settle old scores. Vincent's chair scraped back. You think putting her in charge will save this? I know it will, Jim replied. By the time they left the building, Vincent was already on the phone, his voice raised in anger. But outside, the October air felt sharp and clean, like the first deep breath after a storm. That night, Grace Thompson stood on a makeshift stage in Harlem, her voice carrying over the crowd gathered in front of the clinic. They're trying to take away something that belongs to this community, she said, her words amplified by a tinny PA system. Are we going to let them? The crowd roared back, no. One by one, patients and families took the microphone. A veteran who had walked for the first time in 7 years. A teenage girl who'd received a scholarship to study occupational therapy. A mother whose son's depression had lifted after months of counseling. Each story was a brick in the wall they were building against Vincent's lies. Lila stood at the edge of the stage, her heart tight in her chest. This wasn't just about defending her name or even Jim's. It was about protecting the people who had already begun to believe in the possibility of something better. 2 days later, Daniel Hayes walked into the Harlem clinic. Jim hadn't seen his former business partner since the accident. The fallout over the company's sale had been bitter and final. But Daniel extended his hand, his expression earnest. I heard what Vincent's been doing. If you'll have me, I'd like to help. Jim looked at him for a long moment before shaking his hand. Welcome back. Daniel's expertise in corporate governance proved invaluable. He joined the foundation's board, helping Lila implement stronger transparency policies and donor outreach programs. With Daniel and Grace working alongside her, the clinic's momentum grew, not shrank. Meanwhile, Vincent's influence began to crumble. Anonymous leaks revealed his role in planting the false financial reports, and donors he'd courted for years began distancing themselves. An investigative journalist from the New York Ledger contacted Lila for a piece on "The Woman Who Saved a Millionaire's Mission," and while she hesitated to participate, Jim convinced her. Tell your story before someone else does, he said. When the article ran, it painted a picture not of scandal, but of resilience, how a woman who'd once sworn off healing had built a foundation capable of changing lives. Donations surged. The clinic expanded its staff. And Vincent Crowley, once untouchable, found himself answering questions from regulators instead of board members. By the end of the year, the Emma Bennett Foundation wasn't just surviving, it was thriving. And for the first time, Jim and Lila could turn their attention from defense to the future. But that night in the boardroom had changed them both. Jim had given up his title, but in doing so, he had gained something far more valuable, a renewed sense of purpose. And Lila, thrust into leadership under fire, had discovered a strength she hadn't realized was still hers to claim. Neither of them said it out loud, but they both knew, the battle was over. The real work was just beginning. The Harlem Clinic's grand opening felt like the heartbeat of a city in motion. Banners rippled in the crisp winter wind, their bold blue letters reading Emma Bennett Foundation, healing for body and soul. Outside, the sidewalk overflowed with families, veterans in uniform, students clutching scholarship folders. Inside, the hum of conversation blended with the scent of fresh coffee and warm bread from the community kitchen. Lila Bennett stood near the entrance, greeting guests with a steady smile, though her heart was pounding. She'd spent months fighting to keep this day alive. Now it was here. Jim Carver arrived mid-morning, walking slowly but without assistance, his cane tapping a quiet rhythm on the floor. The crowd noticed. Conversations faltered, eyes turned, and then the applause began, not polite, but thunderous, the kind that swells until it fills every corner of a room. Jim, for once, didn't wave it off. He let it in. They toured the clinic together, stopping to speak with patients, some in wheelchairs, others moving cautiously with walkers or braces. One young boy with bright eyes told Jim he wanted to play soccer again someday. Jim knelt slightly, his voice low but firm. You will. And when you do, send me a photo. By noon, the opening ceremony began. Nearly 600 people filled the main hall, with more spilling into the corridors. Grace Thompson stood at the podium first, her voice brimming with pride. "This clinic isn't just a building," she said. "It's a promise. A promise that no one has to heal alone." She spoke of the community rallies, the stories that had carried them through the smear campaigns, the donors who had stepped forward when the foundation's future was on the line. When Lila took the stage, she felt the weight of the riverstone in her pocket. She placed it on the podium before speaking. "This belonged to my daughter, Emma," she began. She carried it on the hardest day of her life, and it made her feel steady. "Today, this foundation carries her name, and my hope is that it will be a stone for anyone standing in the middle of their own storm." Her voice wavered, but she didn't turn away from the emotion. "This isn't my victory. It's ours. Every one of you fought for this. And every one of you will shape what it becomes." Jim stepped up beside her, his hand brushing the edge of the podium. "I once told this woman I'd give her $1 million if she could heal me," he said, his voice carrying across the silent room. "Turns out, she did something harder. She taught me how to stand again, inside and out." He glanced at her, and there was no mockery in his smile, only gratitude. We stood together. The applause that followed felt like a wave, lifting the air in the room. In the front row, veterans wiped at their eyes, children clapped with unfiltered joy, and even the board members who had once doubted Lila leaned forward, their expressions softened. By the end of the day, the foundation had raised an additional $12 million in donations, enough to fund 2 new satellite clinics in underserved neighborhoods. More than 400 patients were already enrolled in therapy programs, with 100 veterans showing early signs of mobility gains. The numbers mattered, but what stayed with Lila was the way people lingered, how they didn't just take brochures and leave, but stayed to talk, to share stories, to connect. Back at the Carver estate that evening, the house felt different. The glass walls no longer reflected only emptiness, they framed gatherings of people, patients, volunteers, neighbors, sharing food around long tables in the great room. Grace moved through the crowd with practiced ease, refilling cups and introducing strangers like they were old friends. In the music room, the grand piano gleamed, its dust long since wiped away. Jim sat on the bench, fingers resting lightly on the keys. Lila leaned against the doorway, watching as he began to play Hush, Little Warrior. The melody was gentle but certain, each note carrying the weight of the journey they had shared. She closed her eyes, hearing not just the song but the heartbeat of the foundation, the rhythm of something that would last beyond them both. When he finished, Jim turned toward her. "You kept me from staying stuck," he said. "You showed me there was still a road ahead. I don't know how to thank you for that." "You already have," she replied. "You chose to walk it." They stepped outside to the pond, the air sharp with the scent of winter. Jim reached into his pocket and held out the riverstone. "I think it belongs to both of us now," he said. She smiled, closing her hand over it. "Then let's make sure it never stays in one place too long." They stood there in the fading light, the water rippling gently at their feet, the laughter from inside carrying through the glass walls. The estate, once a fortress of isolation, had become a hub of community, music therapy sessions in the mornings, wheelchair basketball on the lawn, evening meals where strangers became friends. In the weeks that followed, the story of the Emma Bennett Foundation spread beyond Harlem. News outlets covered its programs, medical journals cited its rehabilitation methods, and advocacy groups invited Lila to speak about integrating emotional resilience into physical recovery. Jim joined her at several events, his cane always in hand, a quiet reminder of what persistence could reclaim. Vincent Crowley, meanwhile, had faded into the background, his name appearing only in connection with ongoing investigations into financial misconduct. For Jim and Lila, he was no longer a shadow over their work, just a lesson in the resilience required to build something worth protecting. One evening, months later, Lila returned to the pond alone. She sat on the bench, turning the river stone over in her palm, the cool surface grounding her. Children's laughter drifted from the lawn, mingling with the distant chords of the piano. She thought of Emma, of the patient still fighting to stand, of the lives yet to be touched by the foundation. Jim's voice carried from the terrace. "Ready for tomorrow?" "Always," she said, rising to join him. Because the truth was simple, they had already won, not by silencing the noise or defeating an enemy, but by building something louder, something that couldn't be dismantled. A legacy not of wealth or titles, but of standing together, even in the face of storms. And in the years to come, whenever someone asked how it all began, Jim Carver would smile and say, "With a bet I thought was a joke, and a woman who refused to laugh." Thank you for watching. If this story touched you, please like, subscribe, and share. Your support helps us bring more stories of hope and courage.